A graph that spans many APIs also reaches across teams and use cases. Leading a cross-team construct like the supergraph necessitates a new management approach. What does it take to keep teams and goals aligned? How can organizations disseminate best practices and API standards without creating governance bottlenecks? Today, our panelists will tell us a lot more about it and what it takes to be a true graph leader. So, to start us off, tell us your origin story. How did you become a leader of your organization's graph? And what phase is your company's graph currently in? Param, do you want to start us off?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Param Rangaya. I work for a company called NielsenIQ. We are in the consumer intelligence business. And we deal with finding the insights on your consumer buying behavior, right? And so that's what we are. And my, as for where we are is we are in the early adopter stage, right? We have few graphs running in productions, and we are in the initial stages of exploring the super graph, right? That's where we are in. In terms of how I got into or become a champion, I would say it's almost like a self-imposed one, right? With my previous experiences and expertise, it's like the problem that we are trying to solve is best solved with graph technology, right? Graph mindset. So that's when I became the self-nominated leader and then worked through the journey in my company on adopting the graph mindset and the graph.
Jeff, want to go next?
Sure. My name's Jeff. I work at a company called Strava. We are a sort of exercise activity tracking application, also with social network features. We're a relatively smaller company compared to some of the panelists here, less than 200 engineers. We made a decision about 2 years ago to switch our REST API to GraphQL. And when we started, nobody really knew GraphQL at all, including me, but I was kind of in charge of figuring out how to do that. So I work on a platform team that was responsible for supporting all the other teams at Strava to provide GraphQL tooling, leadership support, governance, etc. And right now we're kind of turning the corner on a fully realized production graph. Most teams are contributing. It's kind of going pretty well. So yeah.
That's great. Bertie.
Hi, I'm Bert Lenek, a senior software engineer at eMed. I joined a company, Babylon, 3 years ago, which quite recently got acquired by eMed, so my stories will be from actually Babylon. So our graph journey started when we wanted to create a facade and an aggregator to mitigate the number of API calls we made to our backend services. We ended up with a couple of graphs. They were all BFFs and monoliths in the first time. We were an early adapters to Apollo Federation. We have a graph in production for more than 3 years now. I joined the graph team at a time when we realized we needed automation to facilitate onboarding and to uphold schema quality. At the time, we are right-sizing the number of subgraphs, which in our case means downsizing, but I will tell you more about that later.
Sounds great. I'm sure everyone's excited to hear about it. So from architecture to security to runtime performance, what does it take to scale a federated GraphQL platform? When in your journey did you start facing scaling concerns? Jeff, why don't you start us off with a smaller organization story?
Sure. So unlike a lot of people here who I've heard talk about their GraphQL adoption and experience, we didn't really have to fight for GraphQL at Strava. That was a decision that we made as an organization to implement. So I really had kind of carte blanche to say, figure out how to do it, everything's fine. So early on, it was just literally me prototyping, building GraphQL backends, understanding federation, how subgraphs worked, etc. And I'm a pretty big believer in good documentation, good experiences, and really building a good sort of performance from the start if you can. We knew this was going to be a really big deal for us, and so we wanted to kind of get things like data sources and other technologies that would make it really easy to build subgraphs at Strava, and that's sort of how we've scaled so far. We're now running into more like governance and kind of organizational issues and schema deprecation and changes and that kind of stuff, which is we'll talk about later.
Bertlan, from a larger organization's perspective, what have you experienced?
Yeah, so I actually have two types of scalability problems to share. So the first one was when we were working with the monolithic graphs. At the time, we had around 500 developers in the company, and roughly around 20% of those people contributed to those monoliths. incidents started to happen. A lot of PRs raised. We had long-running testing processes. Even we had to test the whole graph, and we had just a really small change. So obviously that was a friction to the developer community. That's when we looked into Apollo Federation. We wanted to have a way for our developers to be able to work on graph microservices and stitch them together to one big API. And it worked really well when we started it, but as more teams onboarded to the graph, we realized we needed automation to uphold these schema qualities, because the graph team were and still is doing manual schema checks.
Wow, that could be tough.
Leah, if I may, can you also share some of your challenges or something like that?
Sure, I'm happy to share some of Wayfair's challenges. Which ones do you want me to pick? No, I'm just kidding. We have a great time. So Wayfair, we are on our very long multi-year journey from PHP monolith to domain-oriented microservices. One of the things that we knew was going to happen in that journey is suddenly we're going to have our front ends calling many, many, many back-end services, right? So as a way for us to get ahead of it, we really wanted something like Federation. We knew Federation was a really good option, and we also had a bunch of GraphQL folks in Wayfair. So we started sort of thinking about, well, what is the right option? Do we think it's GraphQL? We started working together to actually get leadership buy-in. We worked with a few users. We started a few pilots. And we very quickly realized, okay, so if we have a few pilots in different places, like we're going to need to start thinking through our own scaling concerns. And we spent a lot of time, or in early days even, thinking through what are the linting things that we want in our platform? How do we automate some of these decisions? How do we make sure that people understand the best practices? So it's been really part of the Wayfair journey from day one, is thinking about how do we make sure that we can scale, because we're building this because we know that we're going to need to be able to support many, many different users and many, many different microservices in the future.
So in other words, you have a lot of battle scars.
I'm what?
A lot of battle scars?
Yes. Yes. Did you run into limitations to what you could build into your platform? Right, like platforms are technology, and it's technology and people and process. What limitations did you run into, and when did you start bumping into them?
So I have like two themes of sort of limitations that we have run into I'll talk about. One is testing and validation. The platform team that I'm on provides testing helpers and tooling and recommendation and guidance on how to do testing, but you can't prescribe a solution for everyone. Everyone's domain model is different. Everyone's acceptance criteria is different. And so teams kind of had to think very deliberately about how to test their graph code. And like that was a new thing for them, and they had no idea how to do that. So that's like sort of one limitation. Related to testing and validation, the team that I'm on owns the router. So we are in charge of the sort of the gateway portion of GraphQL. Other teams are in charge of the subgraphs. And when there are issues or incidents, knowing, is it the router's fault? Is it the subgraph's fault? If it is a subgraph, which one? How do you do incident management? Has been sort of a learning experience for us. And the other area where we've had limitations has been around error handling. Our old API is a REST API, where one of the fun characteristics about it is if any of the 75 things that it does fails, the entire request fails. And so our clients had really gotten used to basically having an all or nothing error handling experience. GraphQL is not that way, right? GraphQL, you can have partial failures, partial successes, and we tell people this, we keep telling our clients this, they have not sort of leveraged that fact yet, and so that's like, we've done as much as we can, right? And it's kind of on to them to kind of use the technology we're providing to really go further, yeah.
Bertie, why don't you tell us some of the limitations you run into?
I guess we definitely saw some sort of boundaries in the company. Some people at the management level weren't really sure that GraphQL is the right way to go, but luckily it didn't take long to persuade them.
Which is great.
Yeah.
Param, I know you're thinking a lot about that persuasion piece. Why don't you tell us some of the persuasion things that you've been running into on those limits?
Yeah, so since we are in the early adoption stage, right, most of my limitations and problems in terms of building the platform is from human resistance side, right? Technical problems, at least in this audience, know how to solve them well. It's the human behavioral problem that's much harder to solve, right? So I usually run into three types of problems in my push into GraphQL adoption. First one is the leaders, especially engineering leaders, asking if we really need it, right? And so it's a large company, enterprise company, we're used to working the way it is. REST is the primary means of consuming or exposing data. Do we really need a graph? And so that's one of the questions that I get often. And then the security and the enterprise architecture group that I'm part of usually ask, will it scale? Will it fail? Will it have any security issues? Do we have to worry about all of that? It seems new or newer. And so how is it ready for prime time? Like those kind of questions that will come in. And finally, the last one is almost like a perception problem, right? Everybody, today if you ask even your grandma, grandpa knows what AI is after ChatGPT, and so most people will know that. But a graph is still a well-known term within the development. But the graph is put into different connotation, right? Which is sometimes some people put the GraphDB and GraphQL into the same thing and say we don't need it. We're this and that, and we don't need it, and it's not things like that. So it's about identifying those things and helping both the upstream and downstream people, both my peers and the juniors and my engineers and leaderships, trying to understand what we are trying to do and what kind of problems we have and how graph is the way to solve them. So that's where most of my limitations are.
Yeah. I meet the grandmothers who know ChatGPT and AI. They sound like fun people. How do you align different teams and stakeholders on a common set of best practices, right? We talk a lot about the people, the conversations, the concerns. Did your tactics or strategy change as your graph grew? Jeff?
Yeah, so Strava's got a pretty strong culture of services that have been working in our backend for many years. And ownership of them has been a contentious issue in the past. It's much more stable now. So getting people to say, we're going to now do GraphQL and you're going to be in charge of this subgraph that's going to be part of Federation was not like a hard sell, right? What was hard was getting people to build a cohesive graph. Everybody had been sort of building their own endpoints in REST or maybe adding to an existing one where it was very clear what to do, and it was a much simpler API. There wasn't the notion of like a graph traversal or the ability to even like do recursion or crazy stuff like that. So getting everyone to work together to kind of define a really good, solid, cohesive one super graph that made sense was really challenging. To solve that, it required a lot of support early and often from platform teams and other engineers to make sure that when we're making schema changes or people have questions that we're really always reiterating and kind of focusing on making things very consistent. And that is just a lot of investment really early on, but it really pays off, I think, in the long run.
Param, why don't you tell us about your experiences?
Yeah. So, in the early adopter stage, it's mostly how do we bring everybody into the same place? How do we make the consensus in what we are trying to do and how we do that? The way, at least I've tried to work through this is in terms of setting up principles, right? And I'll say, how do we align everybody on a common principle? And so let the principle drive the adoption of the underlying technology, right? And so I'll give you an example. One of the things that I'm trying to push is to come up to a consensus on product development principle. And I'll give you two examples, right? First one is product speaks only one language, right? Whether to itself or to the consumers or to the backend services, it speaks only one language, right? We call it as ubiquitous language. So once we put that as a product development principle, now everybody revolves around it. Okay, how do I make sure that we don't do a translation on the UX layer? We don't speak different languages and all of that. So it kind of forces us to rethink the domain design, domain-driven design. The second one is we can say, you create the active view for the user from a structured domain relationship model. So think of that as a means to build your active view. Right? And then anytime you have a active or events or actions that user makes it, make sure that you try to communicate that as a real-time event. So that leads in directly to what our query model is, our mutations model is, right? So instead of selling queries and mutations and the principal domain graph, we try to go in and say, let's come to a consensus on what a product principle is, product development principle is, but through that, educate them of how to do a better product design. So that's where we are at and working through that.
Yeah, and that's important, right? That initial consensus building before you start, definitely very, very, very high value to get, and not always an easy thing to be able to do. Were there certain things that you tried to help people with and they just needed to learn the hard way, right? Sometimes you have to sort of see it before you really internalize it. Maybe Bertie, do you want to start us off? You've been quiet for a little bit.
Yes. So we have a schema-first development workflow at eMed, which means that when a team wants to make a change to their subgraph, they have to raise a PR with only these schema changes included. And then they're going to reach out to us, and we're going to review the schema. And once it's all agreed upon, then they get down to business and do the actual business implementation behind it. But in many teams didn't really understand how this works. I guess one reason was that we have a huge documentation on this, and they just probably overlooked the fact. So what they did, they raised huge PRs that included both schema changes and a business implementation, and then they very often had to suggest substantial changes to the schema itself, and only then had they realized that they have to refactor the whole PR. So so most of the teams only fell into that trap once, and then they had this light bulb moment. They understood why we had this workflow in place, and then they didn't do it again.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's good. Maybe, Jeff, you have a few stories you want to share?
Yeah, I have actually a similar but different story to Bert and Milan. So we have a code-first backend system, which I wish we didn't have, but kind of the language that we're writing our backends in and the tooling available is all code-first. And so this combined with the fact that a lot of the subgraph contributors are all backend engineers who really have not thought a whole lot about API development and schema. Their goal is just to get their data from their backend to the client, and they don't really care about the schema, or maybe it's not a front of mind thing for them. And so that's been a struggle. It's been a learning moment for product teams building APIs to kind of think about the API schema in the graph in general, but also a learning moment for the platform teams to think about, okay, how do we improve our sort of schema design and review process to make it a little bit easier to work with. So there's a bunch of stuff we're working on that right now. But yeah, it's been a learning moment for sure.
Yeah, right. Those learning moments take time. You're teaching people how to think differently, right? And I know that we say at Wayfair, at least, you have to move slow to move fast sometimes. Definitely important when you're a platform team leading a graph, because you have so many different contributors. But at the same time, sometimes you kind of need to just get things done, right? So how do you guys balance that need to teach people and sometimes move slow and educate, with also the need to sometimes just make sure you get something to production? Bertie, do you want to start us off on this one?
Yeah, so sometimes you just have to go a full steam ahead and do things yourself, which actually happened to our graph team when we migrated from Federation version 1 to Federation version 2. As I mentioned earlier, we have too many subgraphs. So that was a vigorous task. We did one example for the TypeScript subgraphs, and then we just basically asked the team, could you then do that for yours as well? And then they said, well, I need to talk to my PM. I need to see which sprint we can fit this into. And also, we don't really understand why we need to do this and what the benefits are, etc., etc. So then we just decided to do it ourselves. And this also take quite a decent time. And that's when I learned a lot about different frameworks, and that these sorts of migrations can take time, because not only you have to update the framework itself, but also all the third-party libraries that you have for your testing and whatever else. So yeah, keep that in mind.
Oh, yeah, start early. Jeff, what about you? Do you have any stories?
Yeah, I think like for me, this is obviously a judgment call where you have to say, should I just barrel through and go for it to kind of get it done because it's going to take forever and I just need to get it finished? Or do I actually go slow to go fast later? And like that's a judgment call. And so I have a very unsatisfying answer here, which is like you have to find, hire, and retain people with good judgment. And I don't know how to do that, at least predictably. But when you do find people in your organization that are able to make judgment calls and know when to make the right decision and are sort of responsible and committed to those things, you can navigate these situations a lot better.
You sound like a fun person to work with. I mean, giving people that ability, that's so important, right? It gets them really engaged in like, how do we grow our graph? What are the right decisions that I can be making? And how do I actually build things, which is great. Yeah. So maybe unsatisfying for the room because it's difficult, but that sounds great for everybody else who you work with. So that's a good story.
Glad to hear it. Yeah, thank you.
Param, I know that you're in a little bit of a different place and you have a very large organization, but have you reached these moments even in your early stages?
Yeah, so I already spoke a little bit about consensus building, right? Which is investment in the community, which is investment in the organization across the board. So at the risk of being seen as a philosopher, I would say this, right? That if you wanted to go fast, you go alone. If you wanted to go far, you go together. So you have to take the time to invest in your organization across the board from top to bottom for you to make this kind of what you call tectonic shift in how we perceive and how we do the product development, right? So that's what I would say. And I'm going to plug in a little bit, which is, there is a talk for Leah at 2:00, and there is a slide that looks at different personas that you will come across and how to move from one persona to other persona. So I would definitely recommend all the audience to go to Leah's talk in the main hall at 2:00.
Thank you. Yes, I will speak at length about that. It'll be hopefully fun for all. I love, though, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. I haven't yet stolen it, but I definitely want to somewhere because I think that's such a great kernel of truth and can be so helpful to remember when you're like sitting in those 30-person meetings, figuring out like, how do I align on the next thing that I really need to get across, right? So I think that's a really great point. For everyone in the audience who is out there, like, doing their good work, really struggling to make their own graph programs reality, do any of you have either pearls of wisdoms or maybe like stay away, do not do this thing that I did, stories that you can share to help them persevere? Maybe let's start with Param this time.
So again, I'll give you two statements, right? The first statement would be second system syndrome, right? So most of you who are somewhat experienced in graph would have had some experience in success in how we implemented a graph, whether it is local graph or federated graph, and you would try to replicate that in all situations, right? But then we fall into our own trap. So what I would say is make sure that you stay in the problem domain as much as possible to understand what is different about the current problem and what you need to adjust your tool set, your process, and all of that, and make sure that it is tailored to the current problem. So that's the first advice, which is beware of the second system syndrome. The second piece of advice is Conway's law, right? Which is don't try to create subgraph that mimics your org structure. Your domain model should determine what your subgraph is, what your supergraph is, and your business model should determine that. And if you build it right, it should survive multiple org restructuring, because I know it happens every year, every other year or so at minimum, as well as acquisitions and mergers, right? So that would be my second one, is make sure that you don't, you look for that and you build your domain graph to the business problem and not to the organization. So I will leave it at that.
Yeah, great advice. Very hard to follow, but also really good to be thinking about. Jeff, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I may have given the impression earlier that we had this sort of golden path of GraphQL, and from the top down, we're going to do it and everything's going to be great. And we had the commitment from the leadership, but there's a difference between the commitment and the execution. And so there's definitely a time period about a year in where we had built a bunch of tooling, a bunch of GraphQL support for the whole organization, and nobody was using it. And there's a moment where we were like, is this going to work? Did we just waste a bunch of time? And turns out, yes, people will use it. It just requires a fair amount of kind of constant pushing, help, encouragement. We had other engineers on platform teams sort of embed and product teams for a while to really help push stuff forward. And kind of once you get over that hump, you develop expertise and excitement outside of the team pushing for GraphQL, it's really become self-sustaining. And that's the mode we're in now, which is a much better mode to be in. Still requires help, still requires support. The problems are different, the problems are new. But there's no longer a question of, is this going to be our future? It definitely is our future. That's a really good feeling.
Yeah, that sounds like a great feeling. Bertalan, what about you?
Yeah, so one of the good things about Apollo Federation is that you can pick your favorite programming language and framework of your choice, and we basically...
Even more now.
Yeah, even more now, yeah. So we allowed all the teams to basically do this. And it was fine in the beginning, but as the number of teams grew, so the number of languages and frameworks, which just simply wasn't maintainable by the Graph team. So our new approach is 3 languages and 1 framework each. And that seems maintainable for us. And a second piece of advice, I can absolutely relate to Param's thoughts. Be cautious about the number of subgraphs that you allow on your federated graph, because if you don't, you're going to end up with as many as we did, which just wasn't great. It's simply too much. So I would suggest everyone to think of top-level business concerns when they design the subgraph as opposed to features.
What makes it too many? Because people are doing it at the line-by-line level? Is it because they're not thinking about the larger concept? When did you know you hit the too many point?
When we did the migration from FedV1 to FedV2. Yeah. So at the time I think we had around 40 subgraphs.
Yeah, I mean, to add on that, we did the Federation 1, the Federation 2 migration, and Yarian, who's sitting here, did most of the work for at least creating a PR in other people's repositories saying, here, we've upgraded your graph, please merge this and deploy it. And even that, for us, with a pretty standardized backend system where everyone's using the same language, the same library, and doing things the same way, took a lot of work. And I think you can't get around stuff like that. So finding the balance between too much freedom and too little freedom to make things like this easier or harder for you is always, again, a judgment call. So, yeah.
Yeah. I will say, Bertalan, even supporting 3 languages is very kind. Right now at Wayfair, we're supporting Java, and it's a lot of work, even just support 1, right? And lots of people would love for us to support more, and it's really hard. We have a lot we have to do, so it's not something that we can get to even immediately, even with some of the larger community support. So 3 is pretty impressive in my book.
Yeah, definitely. I think the key here is not to make it too easy to create a new subgraph, but once there's an approval, it should be easy enough to deploy it in a matter of hours or days.
Yeah, totally. So we've had a lot of stories, we've had a lot of advice and a lot of what not to do's. Taking a step back, just as a last question before we can open it up to the room, how would you define graph leadership in a sentence? Bertalan, why don't you start us off?
So for me, it would be providing the golden path, a consistent convention of achieving the goal easily.
I would say just be available to help others identify, troubleshoot, and kind of overcome problems, because they're going to happen and you need to be there. Otherwise, you will fail.
So, keeping the theme in line with being the philosopher, I would borrow another quote to summarize what my Graph Champions is, which is, be the change you want to see in the world.
Love it. Love it. So that's our content and our questions I wanted to put together, but we do have some time and we have a mic in the room. So if people want to ask questions, we'd be happy to answer a few for the time left.
I'm in a position right now where I'm pushing for more subgraphs and broader adoption. So my question is, what kind of problems did you? We're also moving to Fed 2 next month, I think. So what kind of problems did you experience when you? Why is too many subgraphs too many?
So I'll just repeat the question so that it's easier for everyone in the room to hear. We have someone who is talking about how they're about to move to Fed 2, and they're trying to push for more subgraphs to come onto the platform. So the question is, how did you know that too many is too many, correct? Great.
I think that one was for me. It obviously depends on the size of the organization, but I would say that you are fine somewhere between 8 and 12 if it's like a mid-size organization. So again, definitely try to think about business concerns when you create a subgraph as opposed to features.
I will say Wayfair has 80 subgraphs and we're continuing to grow and we're finding that sustainable through some of the structures that we've put in place. 80. Yeah, 80. So like, I mean, it depends on the size of the organization. It also depends on the responsibilities of the team and the accountability of the different teams and like how you actually can support and source that. But it sounds like it's really, there isn't a perfect number necessarily. I think it's more, what can you sustain, and are you building things in a way that is UI driven instead of maybe organizationally driven, right? As Param told us, like watch out for Conway's Law. Yeah. Oh, we have a mic runner, thank you.
Yes, so we talked about subgraphs. One of the main pushbacks we get is that the idea of the supergraph is problematic. And so we have people who want their own supergraph. They don't want to be governed. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. So I'll repeat the question. The question is, for many people want to push back on the idea of the supergraph and they don't want to be governed. So can we share some stories about that? Does anyone have any good stories in mind?
Well, can I just ask this? So if you have a mobile app, for example, a web application, do you want to fire up 5 to 10 requests at the same time or just one? Yeah, just one.
Yeah, I mean, this is now in the weeds technically, but like any subgraph that's part of Federation is its own graph. You can just call it, right? So if people want to have a direct pipe to their own graph for some reason, they can. But I think there's a lot of power in the supergraph that is talked about. It's important.
I would answer this in a different way, right? Which is, if your organization or your product has two distinct contexts, right, where there is hardly anything related in one side of the business and with another side of the business, there is no need to put them together in one supergraph, because they are distinct in the business itself. You may be consuming that within the same product, but they are distinct in the business nature. Like, there is very hardly anything related to that. So in that sense, and we have some situations like that where we are pursuing that as an option to create two different supergraphs. But other than that, like I wouldn't know why you would create two supergraphs.
I'll also just add to that, right? People don't necessarily like to be governed, but usually, if you put your product hat on, you can talk about the customer experience, right? And what it is that you're trying to deliver. And people might not necessarily want to do all of the things, but if you keep anchoring it on value and on how you're helping drive the business and what you're actually able to accomplish, and you recognize the pain sometimes of being governed in terms of just people would like to be able to do their own things. If you say, yes, we recognize that, we hear you, we know it's difficult, but at the same time, the value that we get from being able to do this outweighs some of those concerns, and helping them see it that way and help them feeling heard, that you actually like, yes, we know that it can be difficult. I think that can also go a long way depending on who your people are that are saying this.
Hi. I have actually two questions. One question actually is this: whenever business have priorities to enhance the customer experience, like they want to add more feature for the customers as from the business perspective, and we have a lot of RESTful APIs where we have already businesses, how we will tackle the pushback from business not to scale the graph, add more features for business to do the give lot of new enhancement for the customers' benefits, rather than doing onboarding the new technology top of REST full APIs. How will tackle that kind of situations when your business have different priorities and technology have different priorities for the same organization? So
the question was, how do you tackle when there are different priorities coming in from the business and the technical
yes,
organization?
like for example, business is pushing add more capabilities rather than doing graph in the existing platform like RESTful APIs. So how will you tackle those pushback from the business to scale the new technology in your organization?
Leah, can I take that?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. We get this question all the time, right? And I think that So actually, I do talk a lot about this a lot in my 2 p.m. conversation if you want to come, so you're welcome to come to that. But I will say at a meta level, what you need to anchor people on, or what I have found successful in anchoring people on, is the fact that if we can make these changes, we can actually move faster in the future, right? And there is always a balance that you have to create between delivering current wins and delivering that long-term value. But if you help people understand and see that, like, by investing now in something that might take a little bit longer, might not be an immediate business win, we'll be able to move so much faster and do more things in parallel in the future in ways that actually help our business scale. People can get a lot more excited about it. You will always have to make sure that you're also thinking through what are the really important business needs that I can't push off, right? And setting that balance up front and getting them excited about that long-term possibility for what the future could hold and how much more you could do is a really great way to give you that space to be able to focus on technical features.
Leah, if I can add, I would see this question in a little different way, right? Which is, we are in a migration process, right? We started with the graph where we have few graphs in there, and we are trying to migrate the in the existing REST endpoints to the graph. So the question really is, we wanted to add new features, but by the time we wait for the entire migration to complete and add those features in the graph, it's too late. So can I do that on the existing REST endpoints? So now we have a catch-22, right? If we keep doing that, we add more work to this one. So if I understand, that's one of your questions, is how do you balance out when to invest more in the new paradigm and how to keep the existing one in that? And I think the answer to that is again, you have to relate the value, right? So if you have a proposal that you have to work on the existing endpoints, and that proposal is a meaningful business value, right? It has immediate money attached to it, and then you have to realize that in the near short term, then you have to kind of support both this, right? You'll have to make sure that you work on the existing endpoints, so you deliver the business value, and also plan for including it in the graph migration too. But if you can convince them that long term, right, the value that you are trying to deliver is in the product itself, and it's sufficient enough to do that work once we do the migration, you can even make that as an impetus, right? You want to do this value? Why don't we combine those two goals as one goal, which is I'm going to take that service and I'm going to migrate this to GraphQL and add this feature to it. So I'm going to make my priority and your priority as one, rather than two separate priorities. So that's one way to address that question of splitting when to invest in the old one and how to invest in the new one. Okay?
Yeah, the second question, I think you have mentioned about you have a lot of RESTful APIs, now you are doing graph. So what is your strategy to build a graph? You are rewriting the new APIs along with the new business, or you are creating graph API as an orchestrator APIs top of, you are calling behind us in RESTful APIs, and then you are orchestrating the data using a GraphQL API. So what is your strategy for that?
So I would relate back to one of the workshops that was there yesterday, right, which is supply-driven design and demand-driven design, right? And then the approach we have taken at least is to follow the demand-driven design, which is don't do a lift and shift and put it in front of a federated graph, or even convert the existing APIs into a graph APIs. Revisit the domain problem and then define a proper graph mindset. Again, that's what I said in terms of what my primary role is, how to make people think in terms of graphs, which is a different mindset than thinking in terms of what database is, what APIs are there, and how to fetch the REST endpoints and all of that. Graph mindset is a little different. So the approach that we are at least taking in is to go towards a demand-driven or domain-driven approach rather than trying to lift it and migrate it. Right? So if that answers your question.
I think we probably have time for one more question.
Sure. I was just wondering if you could expand a little bit on the governance, specifically any approaches or strategy you've had to kind of lessen your personal or your team's responsibility for this, right? If you have 80 subgraphs, obviously that's a lot of PRs and stuff coming in. what strategies have you come up with to kind of scale that governance aspect of it?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. That was a 1-year process, just so you know, to get from knowing we needed it to actually getting the buy-in to create the governance bodies that we now have. So I will say that it's a journey, and you can do it, even if maybe it's difficult right now. One of the things that was really important was making sure that people understood the value and leaders understood the value of governance. So what we do at Wayfair is we have what we call the GraphQL Guardians. We circled through a bunch of different names. Guardians was the one that just happened to stick when we finally had the organization in place where they were interested in trying to support a governance body. And Guardians are essentially both front-end and back-end developers who work with the graph very regularly, and we call them almost our super users. They use it all the time, they really understand the best practices, and they're the ones that do most of the schema review and the PR review. They do pretty much all of it. We always have a platform team member in the Guardian groups, but it's the Guardians who are responsible for actually making sure that the governance happens and that we're deploying well-constructed schema to production. The way we got this buy-in was by people seeing things not always go great, right? So we talked a little bit earlier about how sometimes you kind of have to learn the hard way. And GraphQL at Wayfair, when it was first launched, was launched without mindfulness around what are those best practices that we should be disseminating to everyone in the company using GraphQL, which led to things like essentially just mirroring our backend structures within the graph, which is not necessarily the pattern that you want to adopt, right? You want for GraphQL to be more front-end driven, and what does the UI look like, and what is like the way that we can do server-driven UI to make this a really fast experience. By explaining some of the things that had happened in the past, by showing the leaders this is what could happen without governance, and this is what governance could look like in a way that is sustainable, we got more buy-in from leaders to actually support this idea of a governance body and the GraphQL Guardians. And today, we now even have people who want to join the Guardians. They're like, oh, I know that GraphQL is going to be important. I know this is something that I want to invest in. Can I actually join this body? Can I learn more? Can I do more to help make sure that we have really good schema being deployed to production, which is a really exciting development to see given how much effort it took to actually push that program.
Can I add something?
Absolutely.
So when I joined the Graph team, my first job and task was to start working on our linting tool. We had really huge documentation about the rules that we have for the supergraph, so long that I'm fairly certain that only 10% of our developers read it through. And it was also so long that even sometimes we missed some errors in the schemas. So we created this linting tool, and it took it just a matter of seconds to scan through the schema and found all these errors. These were mainly naming conventions, like you have to call this query like this. It must take one param with this name and all these bits. And then we then just only focused on semantical changes, and that speed up the process very much. And now we are looking into decoupling this task from the Graph team and fostering a GraphQL champions across the org who can also do the schema review.
Yeah, that's great. So I think we're essentially at time. Thank you everyone for listening, and we're around.
Thank you.